All right. What is up, everybody? Welcome back to SaberSim's DFS Office Hours. It is Tuesday, June 22nd, 2021. Thank you for being here, whether you are watching us live or watching the recording after the fact. We appreciate you supporting the show. This is a live Q&A style show where we answer questions from our users about SaberSim, about DFS, about sports betting, really whatever you guys want to talk about. We answer questions live on stream, and I'm here live for a reason, right? I am seeking follow-up questions, clarifying questions, right? I want this to be kind of a two-way conversation here. So as you have questions or thoughts or just want to be a part of the conversation, please pop your comments into YouTube chat, into our office hours channel in Slack, right? That is where everything starts. If you have been watching the show and you want to get involved, right? We post the link and a lot of some of the questions start coming in, originating in our office hours channel in Slack. So when this recording gets posted live to YouTube, the description of this video will have a link to our Slack community. If you would like to get involved, we have a great community. Again, a lot of the questions that I answer on this show come from our office hours channel. That's a great place to start. Otherwise, you can always email us, support@sabersim.com. I'm picking out my favorite emails that we get every day in through that inbox and talking about them and answering them live on stream. But if you'd like to submit a question to have answered here on the show, you can go ahead and do that, support@sabersim.com, and just call it out that you'd like to have the question answered live. Let's see, before I really kind of jump into things today, I will note that I've had a little bit of apparent internet instability here this morning. I keep getting a notification popping up. So if this show becomes difficult to watch here or something, or I'm lagging, just go ahead and give me a shout that something is going on or that you can't understand me. And maybe I can see if I can fix that. It looks like it's mostly stable right now. So we will keep our fingers crossed and hope for the best there. Let's see. This is a daily show. We host this Monday to Friday at 2 p.m. Eastern. And on Thursdays, we've been using this time for what we're calling a strategy session, where I pull some other folks from the SaberSim team in, and we dive deep into a specific topic or sport or contest type. So last week for the US Open, we did some golf content. We have done some NBA and some esports strategy sessions recently. So those are all posted up on our YouTube channel. We are planning on doing another one of those this Thursday afternoon, 2 p.m. Eastern. I don't know what topic we're shooting for just yet. We should have something good for you guys. I'll probably know by tomorrow what we're doing here on Thursday, but stay tuned for that. So let's see. It's been a relatively quiet 24 hours or so with questions. I know we had a very busy show yesterday, pushed it right up against the end. If you guys have any questions or anything you'd like to chat about, great day to pop those questions into either YouTube chat or the office hours channel on Slack, because I'm getting that notification again about my internet. Please let me know if it is. I'm actually going to type this. I just typed that in the office hours channel. If I'm lagging, let me know, because I'm getting a notification here. But everything seems fine on my end. Anyway, not a ton of questions in the queue. I'm going to go ahead and jump right in here and start talking and answering some of these questions. If you have any questions, feel free to pop them into chat and I will get to them. So the first question I have here is from Matthias, and he has a golf question here. So let me go ahead and pull up my app. All right, cool. So let me go ahead and get the question up here. All right, so Matthias asks, what is the maximum number of players you should play in a PGA 20 max contest? So yeah, definitely hear this question pretty often, talking about a variety of different sports and contest types. How big is your player pool? How big should my player pool be? And so on. And I think one thing I'm going to start here kind of from the beginning and say that the tool in our builder that is going to guide the size of your player pool in the most explicit way is smart diversity, right? So we've been talking a lot about these sliders the last couple of days and always, and we're talking about smart diversity here. And what this does, the higher this goes, is it's picking a smaller bucket of simulation data from which to determine each player's projection when deciding whether or not they get put in the lineup, right? It is I think we actually literally say it's a better alternative to randomness, right? It is going to introduce some variance and randomness into your player projections, but in a way that builds lineups using real ranges of outcomes and calculating the actual upside of players, right? So the higher this goes, the wider your player pool is going to be. We also, across all of our sports here, back test these default sliders is what we call them here for different contest sizes and different sports by actually looking at real contests that took place, generating thousands of lineups using our sliders and calculating the expected value over of an entire lineup pool at different sliders, right? And that's how these are determined. We put a lot of thought into this. There's definitely probably some value that can be added here on a case-by-case basis, but we feel pretty confident with our default slider. So all of this to say that I think a good start to answering this question for any sport and any contest size is to simply run a test build using default sliders without touching anything and seeing what comes out of that. So we have a very high smart diversity here in this particular case, looking at this week's Travelers Championship, I think it is. And we can kind of see what we're going to get out of that in terms of our pool. I'm starting here very general. I'm going to answer this question generally, and then I'm going to loop back around and then get a little more specific talking about golf here in a moment. So you can see we have 47 players in our pool. I think I ran one of these earlier here right before the show started, and I actually had a lot more, or a fair bit more. Let's see what this one ended up at. I think I had 60, maybe. 51. So yeah, you can see, so around there. And that's basically, what's happening here is you're going to see that our exposures of any one player are not going to be very high. That's true most weeks of golf. Yeah, I think this is typically pretty reasonable compared to a sport like NBA or something like that, or even in some of our MLB contests that we've been building lineups for, right? We have sometimes hitters and pitchers that are extremely highly exposed, right? For golf, we're going to see a much more mediated exposure and a fairly wide player pool, right? 20 lineups, 47 golfers. Is going to be our approach. And that's because golf is a variant sport. We want to capture real ranges of outcomes of players. Projections are generally going to be fairly condensed or similar. There's not a lot of edge in terms of a player's projection versus their salary most weeks, right? Value in the traditional sense doesn't open up the same way in golf. So we have a fairly wide net to our player pool. And you can kind of do this again. I want to stay somewhat general here to start. You can do this really for any sport, any contest type, right? If we were playing a 3 max, we could come over here. Maybe we're playing a much smaller contest. Smart diversity is going to come down a little bit. Let's just run one. This won't take too long. And we can kind of see what our player pool looks like here. But for golf, that is a fairly variant sport. We're going to see a fairly wider player pool. Let's just see what we get building a quick 3 max build. Right? So 18 total lineup spots available, and we've got 12 different golfers. So you can see, I think that's a good place to start answering this kind of question when you're thinking about what the maximum number of players you should play in a PGA 20 max contest, right? Let the smart diversity default values start to guide you there. From there, let me say real quick, I mentioned at the start of the show that Max and I did a PGA DFS strategy session last week for the US Open. If you're playing golf contests, I highly recommend going back and watching that. We talked a lot more in depth about PGA strategy overall, a little bit more time to go into detail into some of these topics here. But one of the things we talked about and one of the main takeaways we had from that video is that compared to other sports in particular, manually editing your player pool before the build can be a pretty important part of your PGA DFS process. In a nutshell, what we basically kind of said there in that video is that there are a lot of players in the pool with a relatively low chance of making the cut that also, should they make the cut, have a fairly low chance at actually getting really any upside in the form of a top 20, top 10, top 5, right? So by removing some of these players in your pool, especially some of these really low salary guys, you avoid a situation where you've created a lineup that essentially has a very low ceiling overall because of the low ceilings of 1 or 2 or 3 low salary players in your lineup. So what I had mentioned there as a possible quick and dirty way of working around that is to use a cutoff. I like to use top 20%, something everyone under 10% or something like that. Sometimes I will just take a total Axe2 and remove from my player pool. SaberSim makes that pretty easy here. The way I like to do that is to exclude everyone. Come over to the excluded tab, sort by top 20%. And you can see we actually also have a very flat tournament this week, right? I don't know if I made that too hard to see. No, it looks like it's pretty clear. We have a pretty flat tournament this week where there's actually a lot of much lower percentages overall in the sim. But what we have here is you can go ahead, and just add back in a certain set of players. This is typically how I will start at least my initial builds and research on a slate, and I will add everybody back in that's over 20% or 10% of a top 20 rate, and go from there. So I guess that's kind of really the other way of thinking about this question, right? Is like in my PGA DFS process, I will actually set a rigid player pool like I just did, where I'm excluding players that I think have low upside, low chance to make the cut, very low chances to make top 20%, chop off a lot of those bottom players to avoid bad lineup constructions. And then you have your kind of secondary player pool, which is actually the players that you end up getting in your lineup, right? So especially thinking about like a 20 max or something like that, you may have some of these players here at the end available to be used, but they're not actually going to show up in your lineups, right? And that level of exposure and how exposed you're getting to certain players and things like that really comes more into play in smart diversity. So I guess in summary here, Matthias, I don't know if you happen to get a chance to watch this live. If you are watching live here, give me a shout. Otherwise, I'll get you a recording of this after. But I would say, in summary here, allow smart diversity, especially as you're kind of getting familiar with crafting your own player pool, to do a lot of the heavy lifting for you in terms of deciding how many players you need in your lineups ultimately and what your exposures to your players look like. But I highly recommend, even as somebody maybe that's brand new to golf, even to do some of this crafting of your player pool by chopping off some of those lower tier golfers right off the bat. So hopefully that answers your question. And if anyone watching here has any questions to follow up on that or any thoughts to share, feel free to just shoot it out. Happy to talk a little bit more about that. I'm always very excited to see a golf question come in here. I think PGA DFS is a blast. I play it every week. I know it can be a tougher sport. I think I hear pretty consistently from some of the top players that golf is one of the tougher to be successful long-term at, but I think it's really fun. I really enjoy the sweat too. So always very excited to talk about some golf or see some golf questions coming in here on this show. So anyway, here, that is the one question that I've really gotten here for the show in the last 24 hours or so. So what I am going to do is I want to talk a little bit about percentiles, some opportunities of using percentiles as a means of understanding variance in certain sports, understanding how you can get leverage on the field in certain sports, really a better idea of what ranges of outcomes of certain players look like. I'm going to bounce over to MLB. Before I get started, I will say this is really kind of going to be me going off on my own of something that I think is interesting to talk about and something that would be helpful to people. We do get a lot of questions about, like, what am I supposed to actually do with percentiles? So I want to talk about them a little bit. That said, we've got 45 minutes here of time. So if you have questions, if you want to talk about something, great time to ask. I'll kind of walk through. I'll probably spend maybe 15 or 20 minutes on this. I see a question actually just came in from Andrew here. This is an interesting question here. Let's see. All right, we've got some questions here. So let's go ahead. We'll answer these first, and then we'll circle back around. And if I have time to go on my own little diatribe here about percentiles, I will. Otherwise, we'll stick to these questions here. So in standard research, a p-value of 0.05 is typically used to determine if events are actually correlated or if the events are occurring by luck. Less than 0.05 is considered luck. Does Saber correlation observe this when running lineups? Since we're talking about percentiles, that's an interesting point. I think, Andrew, what you're probably referring to there is like the 0.05 for statistical significance. I don't really know exactly how to answer that in a meaningful way here, really. I don't know. I honestly, I don't really know a way to answer that in a way that's like useful here in talking about using the tool. I mean, I would say, it's definitely probably true that our correlations here that are very low when thinking about players that are correlated between each other under 0.05 are things that probably can even just be completely ignored. They will often be fairly ignored by the builder at most of our moderate correlation settings. I see you said, since we're talking about percentiles here, I'd be curious maybe, if you have kind of more of like a specific question there about like what you're exactly getting at. I'm trying to think about like applying a statistical significance. I don't know, way of thinking here about percentiles, and I'm not exactly sure the best way to do it. And if this ends up being a little bit more of a very model specific mathematical question, it might be something that I end up forwarding to Matt or one of the other guys behind the scenes here that are a little bit more familiar with the model. But I'm going to jump here real quick to answer Don's question that just came in here. He said, MLB slate question. I seem to do better on the smaller slates. What slates do you play? I play pretty much everything, like every slate that's out there. I will play the big slate, the main slate of pretty much every night. I then play the turbos, the night slates, most of the showdowns. I take a wide approach to my play overall, where I am basically, I think about my play as having an edge over the competition, right? But maybe not a massive edge. And then I try to seek out every opportunity I can to push that edge, right? I think about it as a wide approach rather than a tall approach to DFS. Obviously, it takes a lot of time to set lineups for all those different slates, right? I don't have as much opportunity to go deep into researching every single individual nuance of the turbo in the night and all the showdowns on a certain slate. So that's why I think about my play as being kind of wider on a slate to slate basis. But that being said, day to day too, I also pretty much play every slate. So if it's a 2-game slate that day, I most of the time play it. If it's a 14-game slate that day, I will play it. I personally haven't noticed a lot of difference between how I perform slate to slate in terms of slate sizing. I definitely do hear this from users sometimes here, that there is, folks will say I do better on small slates or I will do better on big slates. That is a great thing to pick up on. I think that implies that you are tracking your results, which is great. And you are tracking your results by different slate sizes or sites or sports or whatever. And I think it is great, especially once you have a big enough sample there, like even like a season of data. You can use that to your benefit, right? If you find that you struggle and lose money on slates over 12 games or 10 games, and DFS is primarily about being as profitable as possible to you, then you can cross those games off your list or play lower volume. And if you find that you do really well on showdowns or something like that, right? I know Chris here, I don't know if Chris is watching today, but he has a really strong showdown process, right? And I was just talking to him the other day, and he said that, he does really well on MLB showdowns and therefore plays more and commits more to his bankroll, right? That's part of the reason why tracking your bankroll is so important. That's why it can be so helpful. So if you are finding that you are successful on some slates more than others, I think it's useful to emphasize that. In terms of trying to get better at slates that maybe you're not doing so well at, I like to, this is where it gets hard, and it depends a lot on sport to sport. But that you can do some review here, essentially, of your process and identify, what are the similarities to small slates, right? If you're finding that you're doing really well in small slates, slate to slate, those are going to be contests where you're probably going to have a little bit of a wider player pool. You're going to have a little bit more ownership fade. Your correlation might go down a little bit. It may be that you are playing too chalky on some of your larger slates, right? That's just one way of how you could kind of start thinking about that in terms of how can I apply what I've learned on slates that I'm doing well on to slates that I'm not doing so well on. So, but I think it's a great question. I think it's an important thing to keep in mind. And yeah, let's see. I did get a little bit of follow up. Let's see. Okay, so Jock Peterson is correlated to Chris Bryant 0.11, but correlated to Wilson Contreras 0.03. Will it treat Contreras as the value listed or as 0 since it isn't statistically significant? I don't want to speak on this too specifically because I don't have I don't have like a deep statistics background. I'm familiar with these p-values, thinking about statistical significance. My understanding here is that my understanding here is that is a way of looking at. I don't know. I don't believe we're just ignoring correlation values, right? That's I guess the big thing right here is that this isn't a p-value of 0.05. It's been a while since I've looked at that. I don't believe these are coefficients of correlation. Is that what the p-value is typically used as? Maybe Andrew, I'm curious. Like, it's been so long. I don't want to go off on a. I don't think those p-values are actual coefficients of correlation. Like, I think we're talking about two different things. It's okay, yeah. So a study's significance level is the probability of a study. So it's a probability. So it's a different calculated number. It's also obviously like these are coming from experimental observations, whereas we're actually talking about coefficients of correlation on simulated data in a way that's meant to be predictive. So we're getting into like some statistical nuance here that I just like am not. I wouldn't even be comfortable enough probably just like chatting about this at the bar, much less here trying to explain something with people watching me live as I try to stumble through this. But I would say, Andrew, what I think is going on here is that these are actually different calculated values, right? We're talking about a coefficient of correlation in one place and a probability in another. Because we're not just wiping out low correlation. They come into account. They come into play in a way that is like, I'm trying to think about the right way to say this, right? Lower correlation values are taken into account less with the correlation slider, but they are not just ignored past a certain number. And the main reason why, too, is that like there's a stacking correlation value. So if you have Wilson Contreras in your lineup, let's just pull up the Cubs using your example here. So you have Contreras in your lineup, and yeah, maybe he is only 0.03 correlated to 0.04 correlated to Chris Bryant. But if you also have Hayward and Rizzo and Alcantara in your lineup, right? there's a stacking correlation effect across the entire team that we wouldn't want to just ignore low correlation values completely. So that's about, I think, as far as I feel comfortable going with that. And if you have more questions about that, especially as it really gets into the mathematical, statistical nuance behind the model, pop those back into the Office Hours channel on Slack, and I might tag somebody that is a little bit more intimately familiar with the actual math that's happening behind the model, and maybe they can help answer that question. So anyway, hopefully that was kind of helpful. Again, it honestly sounds like maybe you have a little bit more statistics background than I do here. So, but if you have any other thoughts on that or any other follow-up here, pop that in chat. If anyone else has any other questions, I don't see any other questions that have rolled in here yet. It is a great time to, let's see, to shout them out if you do here. I'll give it maybe a couple minutes here. Andrew said, thank you, Jordan. Yeah, hopefully that was helpful. Again, some probably been like since college or maybe high school since I remember diving into some of the statistic stuff. But anyway, keeping me on my toes though, for sure. Okay, cool. Here's what I'm going to do. I want to talk a little bit about this percentiles thing. I think this is just a cool way of visualizing some of this stuff. This may be helpful to you guys. This may not. It's again, this is something as kind of a research tool, but I really want to talk here a little bit about just a way that you can use percentiles to kind of visualize your ranges of outcomes and the way you can get leverage on the field, right? So what I was doing when I was experimenting with this earlier this morning is, you know, if we take a team like, I think Oakland is our highest implied total team right now at the moment, right? So it stands to reason that they are probably going to be fairly chalky. Who's our chalkiest team? That might be actually a better way of doing this. Houston, we're expecting some Detroit. Let's just go ahead and look at Oakland, right? And what I'm going to essentially do is using a middle outcome, right? Their average ranges of outcomes. Let's just look, assuming we stacked the stack optimally by projection. So that would be like a 1, 2, 3, 4, 7 stack. And let's just see how many points we get out of stacking that team at their middle outcome, right? So it's, I'm going to just average this, but it's like 10 plus 9.8 plus 9.5 plus 9.25 plus 7.85, right? So you're getting 46.9 points out of that Oakland stack at the median outcome, right? And now let's look at a team that is projected to do really poorly here. I think it is the Royals. We have at a very low 3.2 point outcome, right? And what we are going to see here, let's see what happens, what our expected points are at a middle outcome for the Royals when they are stacked optimally as well. So that would be 776, 682. I'm just summing these up, right? I'm taking the top 5 players, assuming a 5 stack, and summing this up. So we get 32.4 points out of the Royals, right? So our highest projected team, we got 46.9 points. That was the A's. And our lowest projected team, that's 32.4 points, right? So we have essentially, I guess it might actually be helpful if I was also sharing my calculator. I wonder if... let's see. Maybe there's actually a way I can do this. Let's see. Does that work? Okay, wait 1 sec here. Let me also... all right, we'll do that. So you can see my calculator. Might make this a little easier. And then if I pull up calculator here, yeah, okay. So it works. Okay, so we are essentially perceiving here that A's are essentially like 45% of a better play than the Royals, right? And this is how a lot of median projection-based optimizers are going to build lineups, and they're looking at median projections, and this is how ownership gets to be the way it is, right? When you look at the best play versus the worst play, you see these kinds of big, right? It is 144% better to play the A's, right? What happens when we start looking at ceiling outcomes, right? And this is I'm looking specifically at hitters and I'm looking at stacks, right? So if we start to look at now what happens when those players hit their ceiling, and we look at the 85th percentile outcome, right? The outcome that happens 15% time, the outcome that a team hits, or I guess players hit 15% of the time or less. And let's go ahead and look back at this, right? So we look at Oakland now, right? That was the team we started with. And now we're going to say they're stacked optimally. They're going to score you 18 plus 16, 91 points. And we go to the Royals. And they're going to score you stacked optimally, again, using the 5 highest players. Wait, I think I missed one. 17 plus 16 plus 14 plus 14 plus 14. 75, right? And now let's look. 91 divided by 75. Now it's 120%, right? So we had 144%, 120%. And let's do this one more time at the 95th percentile, right? This is what I like to think of as approaching a player's really like almost their absolute ceiling. This is 2 standard deviations away from their mean. This is really in many ways like their actual realistic mathematical ceiling. When you go to 99, which we do have here, you are really your 3 standard deviations away from their mean, and talking about some ranges of outcomes that are extremely, well, not extremely. I mean, they're fairly unlikely. But let's look at this now at the 95th percentile. And I think if you are kind of following along here, you're getting where I'm going with this. So let's go ahead and now look here. And hopefully I picked a good example here. This is generally very true, but not explicitly always super demonstratable between 2 teams. And now let's look. So that was 127, and we'll look at the oops, 23 plus 21 plus 20 plus 19 plus 19. Okay, so 127 divided by 102. Okay, so it didn't drop again one more at the 95th percentile. My point I'm trying to make here is that the ranges of outcomes, there's this almost implied ceiling looking at stacks of like, you know, the highest median projected outcome team is going to approach the lowest median projected outcome team at their highest ceiling point, right? And that's going to be true of pretty much every team here. And that's mostly true because like a team isn't, except for in generational circumstances, they're not going to go out and score like 25 runs, right? Almost every team on the slate has the 10 to 15-ish run ceiling. And where that comes into play and where that is important is that when we are trying to build lineups that are optimized for upside, right? We're trying to build lineups that capitalize when a ceiling outcome is hit, right? We don't really care what happens in the event that a team does almost anything under maybe their 85th percentile outcome or their 75th percentile outcome, because if you are roster those players, you're not going to win anyway, right? So we're really interested in looking at a team's how close the teams are, how much better is one team to play at their ceiling outcomes, right? So where this starts to get interesting is when looking at ownership. So if we look, again, it's a big slate today. I maybe should have done this for a smaller slate. But if we start to look at ownership, right, and we look at the ownership it takes to roster that same Oakland stack, let's just assume that we're going to take averages here. Let's just assume that it takes roughly 50% summed ownership, right? 10, 10, 10, 10, 10 to roster that stack. And it takes approximately, 10% total ownership to roster the Royal stack. The A's stack is being owned 5 times as much here theoretically than the Royal stack. At a median outcome or a mean outcome, they have a 50% more projected points value compared to the stack, but that diminishes at the higher ranges of outcomes, right? This is like really what variance is when we're thinking about variance, right? This is what wide ranges of outcomes literally look like. And using percentiles gives us a way to kind of visualize this, right? So we can actually then, coming around kind of full circle here, I didn't want to exclude, I wanted to unfilter. We can then kind of think about what is our actual expectation about what kind of lineups we get when we use the percentiles at different values, right? So let's run a test build here for today. This is probably the latest I've ever actually gone in office hours before running a test build here. But let's run our test build, right? This is default settings. This is an average percentile here. And we're just going to run this, right? And our expectation here, none of the teams are too highly projected owned right now. It's a big slate. But we have kind of an expectation about what the teams that SaberSim likes the most are. So we talked about the A's, but the Astros are also projected highly, the Cardinals and the Tigers as well, and the Cubs, right? So I think at a moderate ownership fade on a slate where there's going to be pretty spread out ownership right now, running at average percentile, I'm going to expect to see a lot of stacks of those teams. We probably will here. So let's give this a second to run here. Give this just a moment here. Let me know if you guys have any questions as I'm walking through this here, right? I was thinking about this a lot in the hour leading up to the show here today. This is something that definitely kind of resonates with me in terms of a way of thinking about percentiles and ranges of outcomes. But if it's not clear to you guys, or let me know. But let's see what we're getting out of this, right? So we're getting Detroit, Houston. Look, here's the teams, right? The exact teams that we expected. So now let's go ahead and stick that percentile at 95% and run another build. Let the projections update and refresh and run another build. We're looking at that 95th percentile outcome, right? Like the two standard deviation ceiling outcome. And let's see then what we're getting out of our stacks, right? And this really rings true the smaller the slate. I actually think this may have been more useful looking at yesterday. If we have the time, it sounds like we probably will have the time here. Maybe I'll go back and look at some of the same things here on yesterday's slate, especially where there's one really chalky team. Like there was. I guess there were the Reds chalk was secondarily pretty chalky, but it was really all about the Astros yesterday. But let's let this build here. The expectation, though, from what we just saw in the math, right, that teams are all approaching similar 85th, 95th percentile outcomes would be that we're more spread out in our stacks because we're feeding the builder different inputs. We're feeding the builder 95th percentile projections where some of that condensing at the ceiling is taking place. So now let's look at our stacks, right? We actually got a lot of the same teams, but we did get a lot more Cardinals, which are one of the lower projected teams. I guess we did get some of the similar stacks here. So maybe it's a little bit easier to look at this on a smaller slate. But I guess the point that I'm making is that, or I guess the point that I really want to make, and it differs when you're looking at the individual slate-to-slate values, is that ownership, especially for hitting stacks, condenses on teams based on a median projection value that doesn't actually impact or doesn't actually correlate with the way that lineups win tournaments, right? Lineups don't win tournaments because of an edge that one team has over another at their median outcome manifests, right? If every team just goes out and scores their exact mean or median tonight, I guess that's the better way of thinking about it. Yeah, sure. The handful of teams that are slightly better projected at that level have some advantage, but that's never the way that these tournaments actually end up being won. But that's the way in which ownership condenses. That's what people look at. That's the way almost every optimizer on the market builds lineups, right? And you can use percentiles to literally mathematically kind of visualize and calculate this, right? So we saw, looking at this, that the advantage that the best team on the slate as of right now, the A's, have over the worst team on the slate right now, which is the Royals, drops essentially in half by percentage when you make a jump from looking at that team's average percentile outcome to their 85th percentile outcome. And this is the outcome, or anything above that, that is actually what wins you your tournament, right? And this not to say go out and play the Royals or stack the Royals, right? I mean, they're still going up against a great pitcher. They're not projected highly. But what it is meant to say is that the ownership as it relates to those teams is unlikely to be efficient. Because we're already seeing, we just looked, right? The A's are probably going to be 5 times more owned than the Royals stack. They're only projected 50% better at their median outcome, right? That's already seems like an inefficient ownership. And at their 85th percentile outcome, they're only a 20% better team, but they're being owned 500% times more, right? And this can really even get pressed looking at a team that's much closer, right? Like a team that is maybe like the White Sox are at a 4.7 run total. Their 85th percentile outcome is probably, you can even see it here, right? It's very, very close to what a team like Oakland's is going to be. And the ownership rarely accurately reflects that. I want to take one look here real quick. Again, it is always an interesting, especially when I'm kind of going off and talking about something that I've chosen to talk about here. Oh, this is actually, whoops. When I've actually gone off here, hold on. Let me bring this back here and go back to just SaberSim. When I'm talking about a topic that's just interesting to me and wasn't asked directly, the effect of me just sitting in a room by myself, looking at the computer, talking about it, how strange that kind of feels is amplified. So if you guys have thoughts about this, or if this doesn't make sense, or you have questions or comments or just anything at all, feel free to chime in here. I'm going to show it off here on yesterday's slate a little bit more, because I think on a 14-game slate, it's harder to see this, and ownership gets so spread out anyway. But yesterday, right, we had the Astros Super Chalk, right? I think some people got on Reds with some of the weather news, but we can do the same thing here, right? So let's look. I'm not going to spend too much time. Let's look at 50th percentile, and let's just quickly add this up, right? So again, looking at the Astros, stacked optimally, their top 5 projected players, looking at median projection, right? That you get 41 points out of stacking them if they hit their median projection. And the worst team we had on the slate was surprisingly the Dodgers here, who would give you 7 plus 6 plus 5 plus 5 plus 5. 28 points, right? So, and let's quickly grab ownership here too. So looking at their ownership, they're approximately, let's say 4 plus 5 plus 8 plus 3 plus 3. Oops. 4 plus 5 plus 8 plus 3 plus 3. Costs you 23% ownership to get the Dodgers. And it would have costed you 23 plus 21 plus 21 plus 16 plus 22, 103% ownership to get the Astros, right? So again, right off the bat, you have a team that is 41 divided by 28. Again, essentially 50% better, 146% is what you get out of there. Better, the Astros, than the Dodgers in terms of their expected volume at their median outcome, than the Astros are better than the Dodgers, right? At that level, they're 5 times more owned. So we already have maybe this implication that their ownership is inefficient even at the median outcome. But then when we look at the 85th percentile outcome, right? Or hell, let's look at the 95th percentile outcome for this case, right? we have the team that now is 25 plus 25 plus 23 plus 23 plus 23, going to give you 100. Oh, wow, my pen just exploded. All right, let me grab another pen here. Look at this. It just exploded into pieces. I've never seen anything like that before. There's a piece all the way over here. All right, I got another pen. All right. So they're going to score 119 points at their 95th percentile outcome, and the Dodgers are going to score 22 plus 21 plus 20 plus 19 plus 19, 101 points, right? So yeah, sure, the 95th percentile outcome for the Astros is still better than it is for the Dodgers, but it has come down significantly. They're only maybe a 15% better play at the range of outcomes that actually wins you the tournament, and they are 5 times more owned. Like, these numbers get more and more ridiculous the more you kind of look at this, and the smaller the slate is, right? There are legitimately, on a 14-game slate, like when you're looking at a team like the A's and the Royals, like we just did, where there's a 2.5 run total difference between them. There's very clearly like one of those teams is much better. Are they owned efficiently in a way that is commensurate with how much better they are? Maybe not, but they are very obviously better. But on a slate like yesterday, and I guess these teams do have that run total implied difference, but you can see the ownership condenses even more dramatically on the team that just isn't that efficient for what actually takes place at the ranges of outcomes where you roster that team and win the tournament, right? So I guess, one way of thinking about this is, sure, if Houston has their 95th percentile outcome and the Dodgers have their 95th percentile outcome, and you rostered the Dodgers, you still lose, right? You scored less points. You scored theoretically, 18 less points. So you lose. But what if the Astros have their 85th percentile outcome, right? Or lower, anything 85th percentile or lower, right? And you have the Dodgers and they have their 95th percentile outcome. And maybe the Dodgers score maybe like one more point, it looks like here, or like very close, right? This is an outcome that happens 5% of the time for the Dodgers, right? 2 independently uncorrelated events. You can multiply their probability together to get an estimate of the probability of both of those things happening, right? So I'm taking 5% of the time the Dodgers getting their 95th percentile outcome, and 85.85% of the time the Astros scoring anything 85th percentile or less, right, is an event that happens about 4% of the time, right? Is it a likely event? No. But it occurs, and we can look at it even from like maybe the Astros have their 75th percentile outcome and the Dodgers have their 85th percentile outcome. This is like literally what this is what leverage looks like, mathematically speaking, right? It is the field inefficiently gravitating towards plays that exceed their actual outcome percentage, right? And this is especially true, and this is also a way of visualizing variance, right? This is especially true for hitting stacks and for hitters. We can actually look and actually visually look at this for pitchers, and we can see, like, let's go ahead. I'm going to jump back to today, and we're actually going to see a difference in the way this actually manifests for pitchers, which have a more smooth range of outcomes, right? They're more consistent. There's less variance. Let's look at 2 pitchers here. So I'm going to go back to their average. It gets interesting too. One thing I haven't talked about here at all is salary, right? Obviously, player salary comes into play. There is value. There is roster construction concerns, right? I'm really just looking about this super generally, thinking about ceilings. And then going from there, I see a couple other questions have trickled in here. So I'm going to just look at pitchers here real quick, and then we'll talk about some of these last questions, and then I'll get off my soapbox here. So anyway, let's look at pitchers real quick. So I'm going to look at two pitchers that have similar close salaries. And I did this earlier, and I think Kershaw and Greinke are interesting ones, right? They're both around 9,000. Kershaw is, let's see, 21-ish divided by 14-ish. Same deal, approximately 50% better of a play by median outcome. If we look at their 95th percentile outcome, take a look at this real quick. Okay, at this outcome, Kershaw scores 38.5. And Greinke scores 31. So you still actually do have that effect happening a little bit here. That players kind of coalesce towards a similar value at their ceiling. I guess that makes sense too. My expectation here was that effect would be a little bit diminished more. I guess in some effect, pitchers still do have that absolute ceiling there too. But anyway, I guess I will go ahead and leave it there. It's an interesting thing to think about here. It's a way to make use of percentiles when you're looking at some of this information. It's kind of like, I don't think it's super practical to just sit down and incorporate this into your like day-to-day process and say, I'm going to sit here and do this and write down numbers and calculate this. Unless you want to, unless you find this interesting, but it is a way. Percentile is one of the things that I think is really cool about them in the SaberSim app is it lets you engage with some of these probabilities in a very like visceral and explicit way, right? Like we can actually quantify what that outcome that happens only 15% of the time or less is. And you can visualize ownership inefficiencies this way and ranges of outcomes and actual ceilings of players. And I think it's really interesting. And I think it will tell you in general that ownership often ends up being pretty inefficient. And I think that is where, once you know that, that can maybe unlock some changes into your process. So again, if you guys have any questions about any of that or anything, any thoughts to add or any comments, again, that was kind of just something I wanted to talk about. I've been thinking about this a lot lately. I found this interesting. I really want this to be collaborative. I want this to be a two-way street. So feel free to fire off if you guys have any thoughts there. I do see one other question that came in here from DePrince on YouTube. When our projections are final. So we will indicate here. We don't have a game. I'll show you the day game here, how this looks. We'll indicate once we have both teams' expected lineups or both teams' confirmed lineups in for a game with this green check that projection here is in. Also, any player that has this green check next to them, this is true of any sport, is a player that we've confirmed for the game. It varies sport to sport a little bit. It means they're in the lineup or the confirmed pitcher for baseball. For basketball, it means that they're the confirmed starting lineup, and so on. And then our last updated timestamp here on the app will say the last time we updated. Typically, one of, if not the last updates here where the projections would be final is after we get that lineup. So here you can kind of see this game started at 11:10 my time. We must have gotten the Twins lineup right at around 10:47, and that is when the projections were final. You'll see for the main slate, for example, I think we have at least one lineup, but I don't think we have any more than that. This will run throughout the day as we're getting projections in. It looks like maybe we have Kansas City's lineup. So we have the Cardinals lineup. Do we have Kansas City too? It looks like we have the Cardinals and Kansas City's lineup. So a few of those players are starting to get checked. We're running sims throughout the day as new lineups come in. And it's best typically here, I would say, especially on a big slate, to get that last final projections update as close as you can to lock 15, 20, 30 minutes before lock, and go through and make sure all the lineups are in. Of course, we don't always get every lineup before lock, but that's probably the easiest way to do that. So hopefully that was helpful. Let me know if there's any other questions there. And I think, let's see, I did miss one other comment here from Don. He said, I like to modify the pitchers and I let SaberSim make the appropriate ownership and stacking selections. Yeah, and that's the thing is like, the goal with the default sliders and the product overall is that there's a lot of opportunities to add some value in terms of tweaking projections or your exposures or your build settings. But our goal is to, out of the box, to give you lineups that are at least well constructed for the contest types you're going to be playing. And that's why we take into account things like correlation and ownership fade and smart diversity. And even on a big slate like this, like we're probably going to end up playing some teams that are fairly chalky because the chalk's going to get spread out. And I think that's mostly fine. But I think this is just my kind of rant about percentiles here is just a way of thinking about that more in terms of, what the actual probabilities of a certain team or the chalkiest team on the slate of being the best team is. Because I think they're lower than how often those teams tend to be owned. And you can kind of just see that and visually engage with that by looking at what some of these ceiling outcomes start to look like. So we've got about 5 minutes here. Didn't really see any other questions or comments about what I was talking about here coming through. So we'll probably go ahead and just leave it off there. I will be back again tomorrow, 2 p.m. Eastern. Hopefully going to watch this video back, listen to myself talk about those percentiles here for a half hour or so. And I am hoping it came off as clear as I was trying to make it here doing this live. But if you have any questions about that or anything else over the next 24 hours, pop it into Office Hours channel on Slack or email us at support@sabersim.com. I'll get to it in tomorrow's stream. Good luck. It's a fun slate tonight. 14 gamer. Or if you're playing NBA or NHL or anything like that, good luck in all your contests. We'll talk to you guys again tomorrow. Thank you for supporting the show. And until then, see ya.